Hello, everyone. This is Carl from the Fellowship League, which is an online platform which focuses on three words: facts, cross, and discourse, where all facts of reality find their center and foundation on the person of Jesus Christ. And we do this via discourse or discussion. And if you've been following our page or YouTube channel for a long time, Fellowship League, you've noticed that we've been releasing a lot of contents on special Q&As, self-reflections, and live sessions. For special Q&As, we've interviewed well-known professionals and speakers like Dr. Sean McDowell and Dr. Mike Leconia and the like. So right now, as we continue this special Q&A, it's what a wonderful honor and privilege to be interviewing Mr. Bruce Gore. I'll be reading his biography here. He's an instructor. He's an adjunct professor of biblical studies at Whitworth University, Spokane. The lecture was presented to a group of adult students. His series of lectures rather was presented to a group of adult students at First Presbyterian Church at Spokane also. And the bias of the teacher is generally sympathetic to the biblical text, while allowing at the same time for the problem areas in the effort to correlate biblical data with what is otherwise generally accepted from known ancient historical sources, which is one thing that interests me. And I've been following Bruce Gore's YouTube channel for a long time, for many years already. And I've been noticing that it's very rare to find a professor who can parallel biblical history with secular history really well and more accurately than this guy over here. And he's famous and he's famous for writing the book Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible. I believe this is highly recommended for all skeptics. I think this is really good over here. So again, without any further ado, let's welcome Mr. Bruce Gore. How are you over there? How are you doing over there, man?
I'm doing just great. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an honor. And as I mentioned a while ago, sir, I've been watching your lectures for many years. I've started watching lecture back in 2016, and again, I was inspired by your lecture. And actually, you're one of the key players, sir. In fact, you're one of the key players that made me love history. And currently, I'm a student. I'm a student of history. I'm studying.
Oh, good.
History
Great.
course in our university.
Yeah, great. Happy to hear that.
So the first question here, is, of course, is we want to know more about you. So, I guess this is somehow a way of being a participant of or an active person in apologetics. So we want to hear from you, sir. What motivated you to be a historian in your degree and in apologetics? And it's okay if you please share a little about your walk with God in your profession.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And the interesting thing is that I did not know that I had any particular interest in history for many, many years. When I was growing up, I grew up in a very rural community about 100 miles from Spokane, where I now live. And history was not taught by the best of our teachers. The football coach was the person who taught me history. So I learned a fair amount about football strategy. I learned very little about history, you know. And I went to Whitworth University. And unfortunately, I probably would have been a history major if I had known I loved it so much, but at the time I didn't. So I went off in different directions. I enjoyed biblical studies and certainly took that seriously, but never really studied history until I got out of college. And I landed a job in a very small Bible school that started here in Spokane. It was for people who had just graduated from high school, and maybe they'd have a year or two of Bible school before going off to college. And so I was able to get a job there teaching, and one of the assignments they gave me was to teach church history. I had thought, boy, anything but church history, you know, I just had no idea it would be as interesting as it was. But when I began to teach it, especially year after year, the more I studied it, the more I looked at it, the more I realized that this is where the action is for me, you know. And so I became increasingly interested in it. Eventually did some graduate work in history. And to this day, it's been one of my chief interests, and it certainly has informed heavily my interest in biblical history, because obviously whatever else the Bible is, it's a book of history. It purports to tell history. And it seemed to me along the way that any serious student of the scriptures should be trying to put the biblical narrative into some sort of historical context, which might give additional insight, color, the underpinnings of the story it's being told. And so that's been a very meaningful project for me as well over the years.
Oh, that's a very inspiring sharing there. I mean, I like what you said there, that Christians or people ought to, bring out the Bible that purports history.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely agree with that, because there are lots of I think the pieces of evidence are very they're overflowing. they're
Mm-hmm.
all around the world. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and for the viewers here, Spokane is in Washington State, right? And,
That's right.
It's
Washington
different.
State.
It's different from Washington D.C.
That's correct.
So don't confuse with that.
Different by 3,000 miles. So we are.
3,000.
If you look at a map of the United States, the mainland, Washington State is the most extreme northwest state, and so we're right there in the corner of the United States in the west, or in the north, and that's where I've lived all my life.
Yeah, and it's funny that you look at the map of the United States, that Washington State and Washington D.C. are way in the corner.
That's right.
Both ends.
True.
Far ends. Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, this is getting a little interesting. So, the next question here is, what is history? I mean, how important is not only church history but Judeo-Christian history in the 21st century nowadays? I mean, what are the important signposts or guides to consider in studying this Judeo-Christian history?
Right. There's a well-known Christian theologian you may have heard of named F.F. Scott, and he's written many books over the years. And in one of those books, he made the comment that Christianity is tethered to history. And the point he was making was that while many religions have wonderful platitudes, good teachings, helpful philosophy, great counsel, there's really only one religion that claims to base its entire theology on actual historical events that took place, such that if you had been there with a camera, you could have taken a picture of it. You could have taken a picture of Jesus on the cross. You could take a picture of the empty tomb. That all of that took place not in a kind of mythical world, but rather took place in the day-to-day flow of ordinary historical events. But of course, the story of Christ is anything but ordinary. It's part of the reason we are still feeling the impact of his life 2,000 years later, because he had this powerful effect on the flow of history. So much so that when I say it's the year 2021, we immediately know it's 2021 from the time of Christ. And history, the whole world recognizes a calendar based on that historical event. That doesn't necessarily prove that the Christian faith is true, but it does prove that if you're going to understand the Christian faith, you must understand it in connection with actual historical events. Well, if that's so, then it means that anyone who wants to take their Christian faith seriously, or anyone who is not a Christian, who would nevertheless want to be faithful and sober in their analysis of the Christian faith, would be required to do that in connection with some sort of historical understanding. When I read something in the Bible, I'm not reading something that comes to me as a fairy tale. I'm not reading something that is on the order of Brer Rabbit and Uncle Remus, if you're familiar with those terms. This is actual history. And so then I can ask myself, well, if Jesus lived in the first century in a place called Israel, which is somewhere in the Middle East, I wonder what else was going on in the world at that time. And would it help me understand the story of the Bible if I had some sense of what was happening elsewhere? Well, when we study ancient history generally, we learn that Israel was an independent state for about 100 years. until the year 63. And then Pompey was a Roman general who conquered Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem surrendered to him immediately. And from that date on, Israel was an occupied state, and there were Roman soldiers running around. Well, I flip open my Bible and I look at the story of Jesus, and look at there, I find Roman soldiers running around and doing the kinds of things Roman soldiers did in that day. And so that's the kind of thing that helps me. If I know something about how Rome operated, that might give me some insight into what the story is that's being told to me in the biblical text. By the same token, if I look at the Old Testament, I see references to various significant kingdoms, empires. I hear of Persia, I hear of Babylon, I hear of Assyria, I hear of Egypt. Well, all of those are actual historical, political institutions and places and countries and empires. And once again, if the Bible tells me that some Assyrian king named Sennacherib showed up and laid siege to Jerusalem, I scratch my head and say, I wonder if there's anything in Assyrian records about such an attack on Jerusalem. And if I take a look at Assyrian records, I find out that, yeah, actually there was a king named Sennacherib, and actually he did do a campaign in this region. And it was about the same time frame that the Bible purports to say it was, and that the events are roughly correlative, that one is in some ways good additional insight as to the other. Well, all of that, of course, I think enriches the understanding of the Bible reader and makes the Bible more relevant, more comprehensible. I've talked to people, Carl, who've told me, I don't need that. I just need the Bible. You ever heard something like that? I've had people say that to me. I don't need this historical stuff. All I need is the Bible. Jesus and the Bible is all I need. And when someone says that to me, I say, God bless you. That's fine. But there are some people who say, you know, the Bible keeps talking about stuff without necessarily explaining the backstory. I wonder if there is a backstory that would help. I read in Isaiah chapter 20, in the year that Sargon conquered Ashdod. Well, who's Sargon and what's Ashdod? You know, the Bible doesn't really tell me much about that. It sort of assumes that I know about it. And if I really want to appreciate what's happening in that chapter, it might help me to know who was Sargon and what's Ashdod and was it conquered and why was that significant and why does Isaiah talk about things connected with that conquest. Maybe that will give me some additional insight. So at least for me, while I can appreciate someone that would rather avoid all of this extra homework and, you know, doing research in history, to me, it's been a great faith builder to look at the broader context and ask myself the question, okay, how does this help me understand what this narrative that comes through the Bible, how does it help me understand the message that I'm finding there?
Yes, which begs the question, Mr. Gore, because you know, not all historians are uniformed and not all historians are homogeneous. Like they don't believe they all don't believe the same thing. And as what you said, that there has to be a backstory in the Bible. But there are historians like I'm not sure if you're aware of the book The Bible Unearthed, or there are two archaeologists and historians, scholars have studied this in a secular point of view, trying to remove the biases, trying to change historiography that in the previous or in the previous 2 centuries, the people who have started archaeology were actually biblical fanatics, and they're just starting using the Bible as reference. But then they want to change that. They want to change that methodology, just make it purely secular. So, how can you account for that? What do you think ought to be the methodology of historians?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and I have to say that you know, I'm a Christian, and so not only do I view the Bible as a book of history, but I also view it as the Word of God. That's part of my faith commitment. When I take my Christian hat off and put on my historian hat, then I have to be a little detached from that. It doesn't mean I stop being a Christian, but it means I want to be fair. I want to look seriously at evidence, whether it supports my understanding of the Bible or it doesn't. And I think that's the way any fair scholar would approach a problem like this. And so, I've certainly read historical material written by historians that were critical of the biblical narrative and tried to find holes in it and inconsistencies and that sort of thing. And that's fine. I mean, nobody has such an encyclopedic understanding of every minute detail of history that anyone can just stand up and say with a kind of absolute certainty that, this is the way it is and it can't be any other way. It's the nature of history to have a lot of information, a lot of data. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of massaging to try to make the story hang together, and that's fine. That's just part of what's interesting about the discipline. But I have to say, in all honesty, as I've looked at material, and most of the historical reading I've done has actually been secular historians. The book I wrote that you mentioned, most of my sources were not from individuals who held themselves out as Christians at all, but I did appreciate that they were recognized scholars in their fields, that they didn't write with some kind of agenda or an axe to grind or some sort of overt hostility. They just were simply gathering all the available data. And some of the data comes from Herodotus, some of it comes from Assyrian annals, some of it comes from Persian records, and some of it comes from the Bible. And they just take that at face value and mix it in with everything else and give what they think is their best understanding of what happened. That's the kind of historian I appreciate, because while he may not be arguing for my faith position all the time, he's at least giving me a context within which I can read the Bible and maybe get some better understanding of what its intended message was, not because that person was trying to, fill me full of faith sunshine, but just because having that additional context is going to be useful in my reading of the scriptures. And so that's what I've tried to do. I've found it to be very fruitful, and I've appreciated very much scholars who, while they may not be Christian, in many cases, I don't know what their particular faith outlook is, if any, but I have found that such people do a great service for Christians because they do give what amounts to a nice, objective, helpful presentation of what's been going on in the world for the last 6,000 years. And that does give us some way of putting a biblical story into that as well.
Yes, I guess that's consistent with because what I've been learning as first philosophy as fundamental, the fundamentals of being an historian is you look at the facts, right? And facts speak for themselves. Yeah. And I think there's this one work, I think we're using this like as a Bible for historians, E.H. Carr. He wrote the book on what is history and all that. And he said something about the facts and the historian, that the historian without the facts is rootless, and the facts without the historian is meaningless. So there's so both of them have to be there, but at the same time, historians are people driven by their presuppositions.
Absolutely.
So so they have beliefs that can either influence them, or test them.
Absolutely.
So. And I agree what you said, that I think we should always look at what the facts say, and I think that is something for throughout the whole time. It's challenging.
And it's interesting your comment about facts. The famous statement, "Facts are stubborn things," and it's true. And there are certain facts of history that everybody will pretty much subscribe to. But when you ask the question, what is history? History is not less than facts, but history is certainly more than facts. And so there is an interpretive element to it. I'm preparing a series that I'm going to start this fall that'll start uploading in September, and I'm calling it Presbyterians and the American Revolution. I don't know how interesting that is to you in the Philippines, but I think to us Americans, especially given some of the political climate we're in right now, that might be a helpful study. Well, there are certain facts of the events leading up to the American Revolution that nobody doubts. I mean, these are just facts of history and they're attested by many sources. But the facts themselves still require some explanation. Why was it that a particular event took place in just the way it did? And as soon as we begin trying to explain the facts and trying to explain why one fact led to another one and why certain people said things at certain times, then we're really in the business of history. History is always, by the nature of the case, interpretive. It has to be that way because history is not one person's story. It's the story of every living human being at any particular time. And every person living in history sees it a little differently than anybody else who happens to be living at that time. And the task of the historian is not to, if there were, let's say, 750,000 people in the colonial American situation in 1750, let's say, well, that's 750,000 different stories. But we can't tell it that way. We have to say, okay, well, are there some overarching themes here? And is there some way to distill those themes in a way that's fair to what we know, explains the facts, and at the same time gives some kind of overarching explanation as to just why certain things happen? And so you're right, historians always have biases. I have biases, we all have biases. But it's still, I think, a fair question and discipline to recognize my biases and try as much as I can to not let them drive me, but in fact, let my biases be informed by what I'm discovering and uncovering and so on. So it's an interesting dance that the historian does with the data at his disposal, with the facts that come and the speeches that were made and the events that took place and all of that. It's a fun task. Nobody can do it perfectly, but it's certainly a task worth doing by people who are interested in it.
Yeah, and that's the reason why these courses and discussions are very important. Yeah, and that's what the fellowship league is promoting here. So, yeah, so whoever's watching here, please like and subscribe to our Facebook page and YouTube channel, the Fellowship League. We focus again on facts, cross, and discourse. That's very important. While Sir Bruce, as you said, it's an interpretive paradigm, in the historical context to look at facts and to see them and to interpret them. We also still give the academic freedom for them to do their own methods and methodologies, which really flourishes their scholarship and their studies on to advance knowledge in the field.
Right, exactly. It's when I was teaching church history, I remember my first thought, the first year that I taught church, this is back in 1972, well before you were born,
Yes, it's 30 years.
And I remember approaching the first class the first day and having this dreadful feeling that I knew nothing about my topic. I mean, I've been reading and studying, but I realized a little too late how woefully ignorant I was. And I'm afraid that first class, that first year, should have demanded their money back, but nevertheless, that was a great starting point. And it did. I think the very fact that I came to it more or less as a kind of a historical blank slate, I studied a little bit of history and I had a smattering of details here and there, but in terms of biblical history or even church history, any kind of history, never really looked at it that seriously. And in some ways that, while I probably would do it differently if I could do it again, in some ways that was kind of helpful because everything came to me as a first impression. And there's an old saying, you can only make a first impression the first time, and in some ways I feel like there was a process of these events hitting me in a way that maybe if I'd studied this for many years prior, I would have seen them differently or not appreciated them as much. It was really like a kid in a candy store. I have to tell you, I was just almost beside myself constantly at discovering these amazing people and their courage and their intelligence and their willingness to do things that were frightening for the sake of the kingdom of God, and the influence that they had, and so on. It all just left me almost, in a state of wonder as I was considering all of this. And I have to say, I think even though now I'm into my 70s, I haven't lost that wonder. It's still to me a kind of amazing thing that we are part of a story that has been unfolding down through the years. You and I are living at this particular moment in history. We'll pass from the scene. Probably I'm going to pass a lot sooner than you do, but eventually we'll both be gone. But my life, your life, Carl, the lives of people that are listening to this, all of these are going to influence generations to come. We can't say right now how our conversation may influence somebody, that may cause something different to happen that'll have an impact in history. It's a fluid, dynamic, and really, I think, exciting kind of thing to see the way in which God works through all of these details to accomplish his purposes. So it's really been quite an adventure for me to study this stuff over the years.
Wow, that's very inspiring, Bruce. As if we're closing this Q&A already. But but wow, I mean, those words are very touch. I think it will touch all of the hearts of those who are feeling like me, like they don't have a future or something. I think that's something that ought to be redirect their hearts. That there's hope for everyone, and
Absolutely.
Everyone has their own interests and have their own skills and gifts and skills and talents. So you just pursue the God-given gifts and talents that you have, so you have a better future. Yeah, and
that's right.
Right. So moving now to continue now with this history of Christianity here. I want to hear from you, sir. What makes Christianity so unique compared to other worldviews? In all of your lectures, yeah. I want to hear from you, sir. What are the and with that, in the past 2 millennia, what were the significant contributions of Christianity over there? At least, for a brief simplification for the viewers.
Right. Yeah. Well, that is a great question, and it's hard to answer in a real limited period of time. But I think if you say, okay, you've got a lot of religions in the world, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, a long list, and even within Christianity, you have multiple strands, different traditions, different denominations, and so on. But if you ask the simple question, okay, if I take the Christian faith and lay it down against the other religious systems of the world, are there things that make the Christian faith unique? Things I find here thematically fundamental to the Christian faith that I don't find anywhere else. And I have to say, I think if I could, as best I can, get to the heart of the matter, it would be this. The Christian faith comes to a human being and says to that human being, if you try to earn the benefit that God offers from you, you will 100% of the time fail and not gain that benefit. It is an astronomical benefit that is being offered to you. It is a blessing of such incalculable proportion that our greatest attempts to describe it must fall infinitely short of the mark. But if you try to pay one small, whatever denomination you use in the Philippines, for money, whatever, if you try to pay anything for it, or if you try to, by any sort of merit, earn it, you will lose it. The price tag for gaining this benefit is absolute humble recognition that number one, you don't deserve it, and number two, you can't earn it. The only way you can receive it is as a complete, flat out gift. It's a gift, gift, gift. It's not a gift that's a quid pro quo. I get this, you get that. It's a gift for which I can never offer any repayment. But the effect of the gift, if I receive it, is it will change my life for the better in ways that would be almost impossible to describe. And so I look at any other religion, I don't see that, Carl. I see religions, to their credit, that want us to be better people, that say I've got to do these steps or go through those processes or undergo these disciplines and so on. And then maybe I can move down a path toward some kind of salvation. And the Christian faith says an absolute no to that. That in fact, it is an insult to what God has offered to even try to scrape together some sort of merit or payment for it. So God is proving to us that he is absolutely gracious and that he wants to give us this as a gift. And the gift is both a gift that does almost unbelievable things to me now, and beyond that in eternity, blessings and benefits that virtually defy description. Well, that the difficulty with that is, first of all, it's just hard to believe, because we all think in terms of paying for stuff, and it's hard to receive a gift. If you send me a gift, first thing I'm going to want to do is try to send something back. I mean, it's in the human personality. We want to stay even. We want to keep a sort of balance in our relationships, and so at Christmas time we exchange gifts. You see, I give you and you give me one, and the Christian faith says that's not the way it works. So the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 4, to the man who works, his reward is not based on a gift, but on a wage. If I work, God says, fine, I will pay you what your work has earned you. But the problem is, my life has earned God's wrath. It has not earned God's blessing. Then he says in verse 5, to the man who does not work, but believes, which is just a way of saying, just in mercy, accepts a free gift, his reward is calculated not based on a wage, but on a gift. A gift, no strings attached, just a gift. Well, I don't know. Maybe you know of a religion that says something like that, but I don't. I've taught other religions over the years at Whitworth and elsewhere. I've had opportunity to study other religions, and every one of them has a different approach. So if you ask me, at what point is the Christian faith unique? That's the uniqueness. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff tied to that. Jesus died on the cross. That was part of what made that gift possible, is that he took in himself the wrath that my life deserved so that he could give to me the blessing that he deserved. And that is at the heart of the matter. So when we talk about receiving a gift, we're talking about Christ and his work on the cross. We're talking about his resurrection, because that's what proves that his death was in fact effective. We're talking about his ascension, because Jesus not only provided the means whereby I could be forgiven and receive this gift, but he established in this world his kingdom. It was the major theme of his whole earthly ministry, the kingdom of God. He talked about it constantly. And we're told in the New Testament, the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Christ. So now, as one who's been forgiven and received this gift, what I'm called to do is honor my King and live a life in obedience to him. but never forgetting day by day, moment by moment, that all of this benefit I'm enjoying is just coming to me hand over fist, day by day, constantly. It's just one more sweet gift that comes from Jesus.
Oh, that's really like a way to. I mean, that's really inspiring. I mean, well, I'm coming from a country where we're predominantly Catholic, and there are Buddhists here and Hindus and Muslims. We're actually before before Christianity went into our country. It was the Muslims who went here first. Before the that's how opposite our history of America and Philippines
Yeah.
are. Before Christianity, Muslims in your case in the country it's Christians, right? We have the English,
Right.
well, it's actually three: Spanish, French, and English. So that's just
You have a fascinating history. I agree.
fascinating history. So that's how complex our both of our histories are. Really interesting, right? Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. For the past two millennia, what you said about that idea of gift is so unique in Christianity that we cannot see in religions. Yeah. So far, yeah. I mean, the Buddhism's nirvana, Hinduism talks about being good. I mean, it's always about devotions and meditations, all that. Yeah, and Muslim, there's a worship of a God, but it's His will. It's Ishnala. Basically, if you look at the core beliefs, it's quite different. Even if you listen to the exponents or even the scholars themselves from these religions, it will not contradict to what we're talking about right now. It's really interesting. Right. Now, okay, so we're now almost in the twilight of our interview. So I have prepared like several set of questions from atheists. So I want to hear how will you respond to them, Sir Gar, and this will be very helpful for the netizens because I've been requested to do this. So the first skeptical question here is: okay, we have archaeological findings for the New Testament, like churches, Pool of Siloam, the House of Peter, and all and Israel. So what are the archaeological findings now of the Old Testament?
Yeah, it depends on the era. There, part of the difficulty is Israel, where we would expect to find most of our archaeological data, didn't build the kinds of structures that necessarily survived for millennia. In Egypt, we have the pyramids. Well, they've survived. We can go take a look at them. What we have from Israel is our writings, and the writings have been preserved. There's debate about how they were preserved. That's a different question, but that there are writings that purport to reflect the history of this people is the single biggest contribution that they've made, and that's what we have: the Torah, the law, the prophets, and so on, the Psalms. All of these manifestly were written in an ancient era. And while people debate about whether it was later or earlier, no one debates that it's later than the first century. It all took place in centuries earlier. And so that's what we have. So when you ask about archaeology with respect to Israel, it's less of a question. Now, there is archaeology in Israel going on all the time. And I think generally speaking, it gives us helpful discoveries and so on. It may be more interesting to note that surrounding nations have also left archaeological evidence. The great library of Ashurbanipal, for example, in Assyria, was discovered in the late 1800s, mid 1800s actually, by Austin Henry Layard, and it was just a magnificent archive of incredible numbers of documents. The Gilgamesh epic was there, Enuma Elish, all kinds of other writings and so on that had been collected from all over the world. So that was an amazing archaeological discovery. No one could read this stuff at the time, it was all in cuneiform, and so it took a few years to figure that out. But eventually we were able to decipher it and learn that these narrative being told there bore striking resemblance to a fair amount of the narrative that comes to us through the writings of the Jewish people. And so there's a multi-disciplines here. You have uncovering stones and so on, right? Various kinds of writings engraved in tablets, that kind of thing. And you say, okay, this is the story being told by this particular Assyrian source or this Persian source or something like that. And we ask, okay, what does this writing from the people of Israel tell us? And while there's certainly discrepancies, anybody would grant that, there is at the same time a striking degree of a kind of uniform story. So the discrepancies are in some cases in the details, but the broader narrative actually hangs together pretty well. I mean, there's wonderful books written that give particular examples of some of this. The Moabite stone, for example, gives an insight into a particular issue that took place in Israel. It's just mentioned in passing in Old Testament records, and yet here's a stone that was discovered in the region that was ancient Moab, which basically tells the same story. Just that kind of thing pops up here and there. So it's a wonderful task. I'm not a scholar in archaeology, so I can get out of my depth here pretty quickly, but that there are good resources that give us some kind of documentation of that. I think anybody that takes a casual look at the topic will find that there's a fair amount of data there that can be very helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sir Gore, you mentioned about King Sennacherib earlier, and I guess there's an archaeological finding of the Taylor prison, the hexagonal prison, that talks about brings out more detail into
Right.
King Sennacherib was planning to invade Israel, but then he went back to Nineveh. I mean, why did he come back? There has to be reason.
Yes.
And Isaiah somehow gave the cause of his returning. And
that's right. And you see, the Assyrians were great propagandists. So we look at the Assyrian record and we find that he tells the same story, but he spins it heavily in favor of the Assyrian version of it. But you look at the basic facts, as we were talking about, they are actually the same facts. He came down to conquer. He didn't conquer. He went home, and and somehow or other, what he planned to be a great success turned out to be something less than that. The Bible says that he was the victim of a great plague that wiped out a huge amount of his fighting force. Herodotus tells the same story and says that there was a pack of kind of a plague of field mice that came through. Well, maybe that was the plague. Who knows? The Bible doesn't mention it, but it doesn't say it wasn't. So, it could be. That's the point. You have multiple explanations of an event that could, in fact, be compatible with each other. It's just one emphasizes one, another emphasizes another.
Yeah.
The Bible makes an allusion to the fall of Babylon and ties it to the Euphrates River. Well, we know from other sources that Cyrus the Great was able to do some engineering tricks with the Euphrates and cause the water level to drop down so that his soldiers could march in and take the city without a shot being fired. Well, the Bible doesn't give us all that detail, but it certainly tells us that Babylon fell to the Assyrians, and it took place in 539, and that's what ancient history otherwise teaches us. So it's that kind of thing where we find that there's a broader context, sometimes very different information that nevertheless tends to be consistent with what we hear.
And that's very, very interesting. That's what interests me. Like you mentioned, like King Cyrus lowering down the rivers and Euphrates and conquered the city of without an arrow or without a shot. That's right. That's awesome, man. I remember also in another lecture you mentioned about the Black Obelisk. It mentions King Ahab giving tribute to the Assyrian king. Right?
Yeah, I think it's actually Jehu is the king.
I'm sorry, Jehu.
I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think that's right. Jehu. And again, we don't have any biblical record of Jehu bowing down and paying tribute to the king that was there. But the Bible does tell us that Assyria was exercising huge influence at that time. so that what the black obelisk tells us is perfectly compatible with the story that's being told. And so once again, the Bible doesn't say, oh, by the way, there's this black obelisk, and you know, it describes Jehu paying tribute, but that there was a King Jehu, and that king was beholden to the Assyrians, and that there would probably be some memorial of that in the form of an obelisk or something is quite compatible with the biblical story. And there's, you know, there are other examples like that just give us good reason to think, well, the Bible is probably giving us a fair recitation of what actually happened.
Awesome. And for those skeptics who are watching us, the Black Obelisk is in the British Museum.
That's right, it is.
I think, yeah, it's all there. I think there's a website there. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, my wife and I were in the British Museum about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was wonderful to get a picture up close of the Black Obelisk. So it's quite a sight. Yeah.
All right. So next question now, which is very. I think one of the things that the objections to the Bible is Genesis. They think Genesis is a fantasy. It's pure myth. Like another example, like Abraham. Is he an invention? Maybe the Jews just invented or worship a patriarch that is invented by the minds of people. Is that possible?
Well, I suppose it's hypothetically possible. With the problem with Abraham is that Abraham didn't leave any big stone tablet that says Abraham was here. I mean, the story we have of Abraham comes exclusively from the scriptures. And so at that point, it's really a futile thing to try to go and find archaeological evidence for Abraham. But then we'd be pretty astonished if we actually found anything. What archaeology gives us is a broad context of what's happening in the world. And the story of Abraham is given to us assuming a backdrop in the land of Canaan, in the land of Mesopotamia, in the city of Haran, which is up to the north where Abraham spent some time. It's telling us a story that is compatible with what we know was going on in the world at the time. And that's really as much as we can ask of it. I think it's it's really unfair to say, well, unless I find some inscription somewhere that says, I, Jacob, the son of Isaac, was here on such and such. We're not asking for that kind of archaeological evidence with respect to any personality in history, unless they were an Assyrian king or something. So, that doesn't trouble me too much. The Bible is not simply rubber stamping what I'd learned elsewhere from history. It's giving me a story, but it's purporting to give me a story that took place at a time. And if I found that the story in the Bible was utterly inconsistent with what was happening in the world otherwise, then I'd say, well, there's a problem here. But what I actually find is that the story of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, of even the Exodus from Egypt, the settling of Canaan, and so on, all of those are told to me in terms that are generally consistent with what was happening in the world at the time, sometimes rather dramatically. So in sometime around the year 1350 BC, the Phoenicians, who were north of Israel, but south of Anatolia, Turkey, we would say, to the north, are complaining that they're being attacked from the north and from the south. And the people attacking from the south are called the Apiru. And the people attacking from the north are called the Hittites. Well, the Apiru was another ancient name for Hebrew. Those two words are fundamentally the same. And so here's the Phoenicians who are getting a squeeze play from the Hebrews who are settling this land and putting pressure on the north toward Phoenicia. And at the same time, the Hittites are putting pressure from the north, and there's Phoenicia caught in the middle. And they send all kinds of letters to Egypt, their ally, Akhenaten, especially, these are called the Telemano letters. Well, okay, nobody is, the the Phoenicians don't say, hey, there's this guy Joshua and he's giving us a bad time. They don't go into that detail, but the story that's being told is certainly compatible with what was happening in the world and what we'd expect to find. And so these letters are raising these concerns and appealing to Egypt for help, and Akhenaten kind of blew it off. He was interested in other things and left them to their own devices. But that set of letters, once again, gives us a sense that, this was a time when this expansion and establishment of the promised land under the Hebrews was having some impact on surrounding nations, so much so that they were writing letters of distress that reflected those difficulties, that kind of thing.
Right. For clarification, Akhenaten was the pharaoh, right? The pharaoh.
He was the pharaoh.
Egypt.
Yeah, he was the pharaoh. He was.
I believe he was the pharaoh that became monotheistic, right?
He was monotheistic. That's right. He's really, we would say, about 70 years after the Exodus, roughly that time frame. Some people have thought maybe there's a connection between his monotheism and the Exodus. Could be. I don't know of any data to support that, but it's a hypothetical possibility. Yeah.
And these letters, because things got choppy, I didn't catch you there. These letters, who wrote this and where was this from?
Say that again. What?
The letters. You said the letters. You mentioned about the letters.
The Tellermana letters.
Telamonic letters. Yes, it's okay if you expand more on that because
that's an archaeological discovery in Egypt. Tellermana, that's just simply a way of referring to the location. And it's a kind of a collection of letters of correspondence between the Egyptians and other ancient civilizations, but a fair number of them are letters back and forth between the Egyptian king, for the most part Akhenaten, and the Phoenicians, especially a king named Rib-Abi, who was a major ruler, and he's the principal source. So we have these two, and the reason he's writing to the Egyptians is because they had been allies, and Egypt had, in fact, in the past been supportive of the Phoenicians and vice versa, and they'd had a working economic relationship. But Akhenaten sort of broke that off. He was interested in different things. He had more of a kind of a religious interest. He was more concerned about peace, and international trade wasn't quite as important to him. And so he really writes back to the Phoenicians and more or less ignores the problems they're having and just writes these kind of detached letters that don't really represent a realistic assessment of what kind of trouble the Phoenicians were in. So it's an interesting collection of letters. It gives us a fair amount of insight into the period. And it's again, I wouldn't say, well, that proves the Bible. But on the other hand, what I would say is that nothing in the Bible is inconsistent with what we find reflected there. And in fact, those Tellermana letters do, in fact, give us some explanation of something that we would expect to have been happening at the time, given what the Bible otherwise says.
So basically, it's not direct evidence, just circumstantial. We can just hypothesize.
It is. That's right. Yeah. I practiced law for 20 years, and sometimes people think circumstantial evidence isn't worth much. Many good cases have been made based strictly on circumstantial evidence because it can be very compelling, So I don't discount something because it's circumstantial, but in this case, that's what it is. It is circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, amazing. Right. Speaking of law, as a JD, right, Juris Doctor, I remember you explaining the Hammurabi Code, man. That's something that caught my attention a lot. You compare the Hammurabi Code with the Law of Moses, the Ten Commandments.
Yes, right. Yeah. Hammurabi came earlier, about 200 years earlier. And some of what's in Hammurabi shows up in Moses, and so people have made this argument, well, Moses borrowed from Hammurabi, and that's fine if they want to say that, but I think anyone reading the Law of Moses and comparing it to the Code of Hammurabi would have to say the points where there are similarities are the points where you would expect to find similarities based on the human instinct for justice. we all have a sense of justice. And anyone who's going to give a credible legal code as to how people should live, we would expect to see some principles of justice showing up. But Moses brings to a vastly higher level the idea of due process, fair play, a trial based on facts and not kind of almost superstitious methods of finding the truth. In other words, to me, the differences vastly outweigh the similarities, and the differences in Moses are all improvements, significant improvements over Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a great thinker. I don't have any argument with that, but it's just when you look at Moses, you're looking at something that kind of shines in a way that is really unique in the ancient world at that time frame, certainly.
Yeah, honestly, one of the first impressions when I read like Jesus saying an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, those are the exact words from the Hammurabi. Because I was like thinking, did they borrow this code? Did they just, it's like so it's as what you said. It's like it's just a development.
Yeah, it's a principle of justice called the lex talionis, and you actually find it elsewhere as well. But it's a principle of proportionality. If I injure you, then the impact on me should be of an equal, comparable sort of justice. I think the phrase an eye for an eye had actually become more or less current, you see, from the time of Hammurabi. Moses lived in his age, and he was aware of common current phrases. I have no objection if he borrowed it from Hammurabi. It's fine, there's no problem with that. It's saying that he's simply reproducing Hammurabi. That's where you say, well, if you read Hammurabi and you read Moses, you say this is not one reproducing the other. Moses is really in a class by himself. So if we find an eye for an eye in Moses, okay, fine. At the same time, there's so much more in Moses that you don't find even hinted at in Hammurabi that you have to say it's much more than just saying one guy copied the other. It's just clearly not what happened.
Wow, that's a fair judgment there. Another question under is Genesis fantasy is the flood of Noah. I just want to hear what can you say about that?
Well, it does seem highly probable that there was a great flood. The Gilgamesh epic is the most famous non-biblical source that gives really a surprisingly similar account of a vast flood. And in many ways, even some of the details are somewhat striking. There are archaeological evidences that have suggested there was a great flood. There was a great archaeologist of the 40s named Woolley, and he did a fair amount of work in that region and found what he thought were irrefutable evidences of a vast flood. Now, the Bible says, well, it was a worldwide flood, and so some people get juiced up about that. Well, was this a flood that covered the whole world? Or was it a flood that was really constrained to that part of the world? I'm not dogmatic on that, to be honest. When the Bible uses the term the whole world, we immediately read into it a 21st century understanding of the world, and we think of a globe, and we think of the planet Earth, and we think of a kind of understanding of the living situation of human beings that was utterly foreign, at that time in history. And so if the Bible says it was a flood that covered the whole world, that could easily, without any insult to the biblical integrity, nevertheless be speaking of a flood that was vast, but was nevertheless not swamping the entire planet, because the whole idea of a planet wasn't even in any people's minds. They thought of a flat earth with four corners. That's the world they thought of. And so given that, the Bible talks about a flood. Mesopotamians talked about a flood. The Assyrians had a flood epic. There's virtually all ancient civilizations had some idea of an ancient flood. The Gilgamesh epic is the one that bears the greatest similarity to the biblical account, but it's certainly not the only one. So, I think there must have been a great flood. It seems like all of these sources clearly didn't borrow from each other, but they do seem to be based on a common source that they're interpreting differently over the centuries. And so, again, while you can't say we haven't found Noah's Ark, for example, we haven't found, that hasn't happened, but that there is what appears to be a common ancient memory of a great flood is not only found in the Bible, but in multiple other sources as well.
Right. And one of those multiple sources could be also our Philippine mythology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's one anthropologist who wrote about the Philippine folk stories and mythologies, and some of our mythologies speak of a flood. Actually, it starts with water, and then we were created out of that from bamboo sticks. That's one of our. That's one of our. A man and woman from bamboo sticks or bamboo stalks. Yeah. But speaking of the Ark, it's a little bit segue. I'm not sure if you were Ron Wyatt's expedition.
I'm familiar with him.
Is it trustworthy?
Yeah, I haven't followed him closely. I know there's been multiple attempts to find the Ark, and I know that he's been responsible for some of those. But I'm not familiar enough with him to have any kind of reliable opinion either way on it. I'm glad he's out there. I'm glad he's doing what he's doing.
Yeah.
But but I haven't been following closely enough to have much of a reliable opinion.
Okay. That's cool. That's cool. Okay, so now moving to the New Testament now. Okay, so skeptical questions of the New Testament before we come to a close is, of course, the common question: is Jesus a myth?
Yeah.
Is he a
well,
myth card?
I don't think so. It's. I know that you'll still run into people occasionally who will try to suggest that. It's interesting to me that even people who are critical of the Christian faith, who are no Christians at all, if they have any information to speak of at their disposal, will certainly grant that a remarkable man lived in the first century. And that the story concerning him immediately exploded into the consciousness of the world in ways that cannot be credibly explained simply on the basis of somebody inventing him. There are records in the Roman annals connected to Tiberius Caesar. Well, Tiberius reigned from 14 AD to 37 AD. He was a contemporary of Jesus. He actually was impressed enough with the report concerning Jesus of Nazareth that came to him that he made an official recommendation to the Senate of Rome that Jesus be recognized as a god. Now, from a Christian point of view, that falls short of the mark, but the fact that a Roman emperor who's a contemporary is getting reports that are so powerful to him that he's making such a proposal to the Roman Senate says, that's not a myth. That's got to be something that's actually happening in history. That's
interesting. I've never heard that before, actually, honestly.
That's that information comes to us originally from Tertullian, who was a Roman lawyer who's writing a few years later, but he's writing at a time when those annals were still available. And he's writing as an apologist for the Christian faith. And he's pointing that out to his audience and saying, if you don't believe it, go read the records. It's right there. It's kind of like going to a law library and hunting down the case, so there it is. Eusebius, who's writing in the early 300s, quotes Tertullian on that very point. And so it was a fairly well-established fact. And, beyond that, the very fact that you have just voluminous amounts of writing that explode into the human discourse of the time, some of which became the Bible, most of which did not, but all of it concerned with some remarkable guy that lived in Israel and was crucified around 30 AD And some people say rose from the dead. In other words, the very fact that you've got that just almost an avalanche of data that is poured into the public consumption about that time suggests pretty strongly that this is not simply a made-up story. It couldn't be. I mean, it's just, it would be incredible. Like, how would I invent somebody today in the hopes that 30 years from now, I could change the course of history by a story I made up about a mythological character? It would never happen. It couldn't happen. And while I know some people out there say that, it's not an informed opinion. We have to deal with the fact of Jesus in history. We have to deal with, what are we going to do with him? Because he made astonishing claims about himself. And as C.S. Lewis says, either his claims are true and we need to bow down and worship this man, or his claims are false and we need to regard him as one of the greatest megalomaniac lunatics of all history. But we can't go with this sort of middle road of, well, he was a great moral teacher. No, great moral teachers don't talk that way. He doesn't leave that open for us. We're either stuck with, this is the God of history and we should be worshiping him, or he was the greatest lunatic of all time. Most people aren't prepared to call him a lunatic. And so that kind of reduces the options pretty dramatically.
Yeah, in terms of the teaching of Jesus, he said something about the golden rule. It's like there's quite similarities between Confucius' golden rule and Jesus' golden rule.
Yeah, well, it's there are actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, Buddha had a similar rule, and I think there's one, maybe Taoism. The rule in Jesus is different from the others, similar but different. Confucius' rule was stated in the negative: don't do something to someone else that you wouldn't want them to do to you. That's sometimes called the silver rule, actually. Jesus flips it on his head and makes it an affirmative thing. Whatever you want your neighbor to do for you, that's what you should do for them. That's a very different rule, you see. One is a rule of negation. It's a rule of just restraint. It's a rule that says, I'm going to be on my guard lest I offend someone, you see, but it isn't a rule that energizes me to go out of my way to do good for my neighbor. Jesus tells me to love my neighbor. If I say to Jesus, how should I love my neighbor? Jesus says, well, what would you like your neighbor to do for you? I say, well, this is what I'd like him to do for me. Then Jesus said, fine, go do that. That's a good way to take that rule. You see, well, that really is unique to Jesus. That formulation of the golden rule really rises above, you'd say, the other kind of similar rules like that.
It's like a parent to son conversation. Hey, you know what else you want, you do it. It's quite fun. It's like a disciplinary kind of context, right? But going back to what you said about the scholars you mentioned, Eusebius and Tertullian, it's quite incredible to see such chain of authority and consistency. Like, the people are basically there's no gap. Like, there are people who are citing them and copying what their ancestors have done, like what Jesus has said throughout hundreds of years later. It's like there's a chain of authority.
Yeah, there is a chain of authority, and the authority traditionally has been viewed as Jesus, as he was departing, gave his assignment, his authority, his agency to his apostles. And that's what an apostle is, someone sent with authority. It's like an agent. And he told them to go and make disciples of the nations, teaching them to do what Jesus had commanded. And Jesus promised to be with them always to the end of the world. So we say that's the authority starts with Christ. Christ gives it to these 12 men. And they go out and begin making good on the command that was given to them by Jesus. Now, there is a difference of opinion between Catholics and Protestants as to how does that authority devolve down through history. And of course, the Catholic view is that it comes in a kind of bureaucratic chain in which the Pope especially gives this authority to successive popes who continue that chain down to the present day. Protestants have had, multiple difficulties with that, but they agree with the idea of the authority. But they would say that the authority of the apostle is not so much a chain of bureaucratic connections between one pope and the next, but rather the authority is in the teaching itself. Jesus said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." What did Peter say? He said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Well, that's a proposition, you see. That's a statement of an identity. And the Protestant view would be that Jesus being the Christ, the Son of the living God, is the foundational truth upon which the church is based and upon which the authority of the church, therefore, continues. And so any branch of the Christian movement, including the Catholics, who would say that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that we are therefore bound to obey him and to take seriously his teaching and to carry on his mandate of making disciples of the nations, any person doing that, any church doing that, is continuing in the apostolic authority. But that's not something connected necessarily to a key being given, as it were, by one pope to another, that seems to be inconsistent with what the sense of the text actually is. Obviously, that's a point of sharp division to this day. I have, in fact, my closest Christian friend, I tell you not, is a strong Roman Catholic, and we've had multiple conversations on this, and we have a wonderful, friendly Christian fellowship where we differ on this, but nevertheless, it doesn't represent any threat to our love for each other, and I consider him a brother in Christ. But those are two different views of it, and obviously I have one view and he has another. And there you are.
Yeah, we now enter to another question which I forgot to. Yeah, I think that's another interest. Yeah, about the Pope thing. Yeah, because I was raised as a Catholic. I've gone through all the sacraments. For baptism, confession, all that, confirmation.
Now wait a minute, all the sacraments you haven't done. Are you a monk? Are you holy orders?
No, I think I'm not. I don't remember. I think I become a. I'm not sure if I became a sacristan. I'm not sure, but I think I led a rosary prayer before. Yeah, I think I remember that, and then I became a Christian. And one of the things that troubled me is the Pope thing. Like I was taught by my Catholic teachers that the first Pope is Peter, and then it seems that that has been accepted universally, that Pope is really the first. Peter's really the first Pope.
Right.
Yeah. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think Peter was the leader of the apostolic band. I do think that when Jesus said, "On this rock I will build my church," that he was in some ways recognizing Peter in a unique status. The pronoun that's used there, the Greek pronoun "su," is the singular. So it's Jesus isn't addressing all the disciples. He's just talking to Peter individually. Peter made the confession. And when Jesus says, "I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom," I think that's what he did. I think the Catholic view of the key has been it's been pushed into somewhat more exaggerated proportions than are warranted by the text, because nowhere else really in the New Testament do you hear about the key of the kingdom. I mean, it's taken on a life of its own that is somewhat disproportionate to what was in the original sense. Peter was the guy who had the key, in the sense that it was Peter that was there who preached on the day of Pentecost. It was Peter who was there when Philip had preached in Samaria, and Peter had to come and confirm that the gospel was for the Samaritans. It was Peter that was there when a full Gentile named Cornelius came into in a sense, Peter was the guy with the key that kept opening the door in the gradually expanding growth of the Christian movement, beginning with Jewish people, but expanding to the world. And so I don't have any problem seeing that Peter, in some sense or other, had a key. I do have a little bit of heartburn when that key takes on sort of this disproportionate importance and becomes something that's passed down through the centuries from one to the next. Not only is that not really fair to what the text actually says, but historically it certainly presents some considerable problems when you think about the degree to which the papacy fell into unhappy, difficult, indeed highly corrupted moments. You know, and any good Catholic historian knows that. It just seems to me history gives us some real problems with that view of the key. So that's kind of a different issue.
Yeah, I remember in one of your lectures also you mentioned about the three popes.
Three popes. And the Pope became quite a political character, and you know, so all of that says, I think the popes meant well. I don't begrudge them the role they played, but I think in some ways the church rather overplayed its hand in trying to get more out of the papacy than was really properly intended by Jesus in that original conversation with Peter.
But in fairness, we can also give credit to the Catholic Church for its translation of the scriptures, the councils, and also the chain of authority as well, because it was the creeds that actually played a crucial role also there, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you would say that the original so-called ecumenical creeds of the church, beginning with Nicaea, Chalcedon, those would be the two most important. There were 7 altogether. Really more the Eastern Church, was responsible for those.
Byzantium.
But I'm deeply grateful to the Christian history that goes back to that era. And so I'm for a Protestant, I'm probably much more sympathetic to that whole Catholic heritage than other Protestants might be. But I just think probably the Catholic Church has nevertheless pushed the point a little too far at certain points, and so I think I have to back away from going quite that far.
I think that's one of the things that we Christians need to practice nowadays. I mean, we tend to really be reactive when it comes to hearing. I myself come from that background. I used to be very objective kind of person. When I say a objection and then someone opposes it, I tend to be engaging. That was one of my past mistakes before. And I think this is one of the things. Second to the last question, sir. This one is also one of the interesting questions. Is Christianity influenced by Greek philosophy? Because I'm sure you know a lot of Greek philosophy. I'm amazed by that. I think, I'm not sure, maybe you've submerged yourself into the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Maybe you can compete with them when they are resurrected or something. No. Resurrection.
Oh, they're in a class by themselves. I'll leave those.
Plotinus or Plutarch. I mean, you know these guys.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing that has the Christian movement been influenced by Greek philosophy? Certainly it has. And it has not necessarily been influenced in a good way, but the fact that the influence has been there, I think anyone would grant. Augustine was a profoundly important Christian thinker, back in the 4th, 5th centuries. And he was deeply influenced by Greek philosophy. I think that he was able to give his understanding of the scriptures without being necessarily enslaved to a Greek outlook, but at the same time, he was reared in a tradition and a culture that had been heavily influenced by the Greeks, and it would be almost impossible to escape it. I mean, we are all products of our culture. I'm a product of my culture, even if I don't like it much. You can't escape it. And so the Greek philosophy was there. I think maybe some of the more conspicuous areas where it showed up negatively was early on. There tended to be a kind of a negative view of the physical body. So there was a heavy emphasis on celibacy, on a Spartan kind of life, asceticism, the monkish life, and so on. Well, that's not really fair to the biblical. The Bible doesn't give us that approach to the Christian life. Paul writes to Timothy and says that There are false teachers out there who are forbidding to marry and ordering people to abstain from certain foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who know the truth. Because everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, because it's consecrated by the word of God and by prayer. Well, that's Paul telling us that, good food, the enjoyable things in life are fine as long as they don't become idols, as long as I'm not swept away by them. And to say that in the interest of my Christian faith, I have to just eat the most restricted diet, and I have to not marry, and I have to live according to a highly regulated that's not the flavor of the New Testament, and really, I think, represented more of a Greek influence, I would say, than a biblical influence. That would just be one example, but certainly it's had its impact on Christian history.
Right. And absolutely, there is some good, I think there's some good things, good contributions that Greek philosophy has given, like the
Sure.
like the idea of the like the idea of the city of God by Augustine, right?
Yeah.
He somehow put the I forgot what those terms already of Plato, that separates nominal from the phenomenal.
Well, yeah,
something
Plato's ideal and receptacle world. Is
Yeah,
that what you're thinking of? Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. Yeah, you see in the City of God in Augustine's writing, you see a little hint of that. But again, I have to say, in some ways, we probably attach more weight than we should, because Augustine is writing in a culture with a vocabulary that was given to him. And we all do that. If I write a book, I'm writing in a culture with a certain vocabulary, and someone 1,000 years from now might look at something I wrote and say, well, look, that guy was an existentialist. Look at that term that he uses. Well, wait a minute. This is just the vocabulary of the day, and we're more or less stuck with it. And it doesn't, if I use a term that's commonly used in a certain philosophical, outlook at the moment, that doesn't mean I fully embrace that outlook. It just means I'm using the vocabulary that's available to me. And I think Augustine did, a fair amount of that.
Right. And speaking of vocabulary, another thing also is we're all aware of the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of Christians nowadays, especially in this pandemic, are expressing their beliefs and, I would say, their passion. Their unending overflowing of energy out of their hearts and minds, saying, "Oh, I believe in this ism. I believe in this ism. I believe in this ism. I believe in another ism of Reformed theology." So, but how can we call this, because this tends to cause division somehow nowadays.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I think it is of the nature of human experience to have divisions, disagreements. It's just, I frankly, I think, I believe, I try to tear down fences more than build them. There are people with whom I have sharp differences theologically. And I don't want to ignore those. I think theology is important. I think correct theology matters. And so I want to stand very firmly with what I believe is the truth of the scripture. Jesus says on one occasion, if somebody is not against us, they're for us, And that's the principle I want to live with when I look at Christian people around me. I may see a Pentecostal Christian over here, a Catholic Christian over there, a Methodist here, somebody else there. I'm a Presbyterian. Okay. I look at somebody, and if they're preaching Christ, and if they're upholding the authority of the scriptures, and they're calling people to a life of obedience to God's Son, then I say, if you're not against me, you're for me. If you're not against Christ, you're for him. And so that's a very broad swath. And I think that's the way we should look at others. Jesus also says on another occasion, those who are not for us are against us. It's exactly the opposite, you see. But in the context, when he says that, he's really talking more about how I should view myself. I should have a rigorous standard of self-examination. I should always be asking myself the acid questions. Is this really the truth of God, or am I just peddling something here because I know that's what you want to hear, or that's what pleases me? Am I prepared to really be ruthless when it comes to examining my own heart, in the fear that I may be opposing Christ? And Jesus, I think, gives me that warning. I need to be very, very careful when it comes to testing myself, but I need to be very loving and generous when it comes to assessing others. And I think that kind of keeps us in a nice balance there. If there's differences, they need to be pointed out, and I think conversations need to take place, and that's all good and fine. But I don't want to start shooting guns and building all kinds of walls and being destructive, when in fact I'm not called to be destructive. I'm called to, as much as possible, bring people together in their devotion to Christ and love for Him.
Those are really good insights, very relevant today. Oh, well, here's the final question now. It's more on suffering, but it's not the common suffering, suffering. I mean, I'm saying suffering caused by religion, like Christianity. We're aware of the Crusades, we're aware of the Inquisitions, we're aware of the tortures of Bloody Mary, or Queen Mary of in the past, and we're aware of the colonial imperialism. In our case, we've been conquered by the Spanish for 300 years, and in the first half of that, we were forced to the core to believe. It's like a cross and a sword kind of interaction. So how can we make an account on that? How can you respond to that, sir?
Yeah. Well, suffering is a fact, and I have to say I've lived a life that has involved precious little suffering. So you're probably asking the wrong guy here. Sometimes I worry about myself because I don't feel like I've suffered enough, But we're called to live the life that God has called us to live. And some of God's saints have been called to a life of really almost unbelievable degrees of suffering for the sake of Christ, and others haven't. I firmly believe that whatever God calls us to, He gives us grace for it. He's not going to call me to something without giving me the inner strength that comes by His grace to go through it. Some of God's people have gone through great suffering and have at a later time been great proclaimers of the truth of Christ just because they went through such experiences. I like the story of Corrie ten Boom, who was in the Nazi concentration camps for a while and made famous the phrase later, you'll never know that Christ is all you need till Christ is all you have. That was her experience. And well, she would never have been able to say that with credibility had she not suffered, and all the rest of us benefit from it. So if God calls a person to suffer, then they should say, God has laid this in my life for a good purpose, and so I'm going to avail myself of His grace. I'm going to come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and find grace to help. I'm going to pray for that strength to get through it. And I'm going to pray that God will use this for good, because He did in fact promise that He's going to cause all these things to work together for good. So I don't think we should go looking for suffering, but if it comes knocking on our door and we're required to deal with it, then so be it. We should trust God in it. God has a great kind of tapestry that He's working together in history, and it's complicated, and we don't know the whole story, but we play the little role that He's called us to play as best we can by His grace, and know that in the end, Christ will be honored and God will be glorified. So that's about the best I can do on that profound problem.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis wrote a great book called The Problem of Pain, and he does one of the most profound treatments of that. So if any of your listeners are interested in pursuing that, I certainly recommend that. Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis is quite good on the topic.
Is it from that book where C.S. Lewis said that God whispers in your pleasures and shouts at your pains. He's a megaphone that arouses the deaf world. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, it could be. I can't say for sure if it's there, but the phrase rings a bell. I'm not sure it's there.
Megaphone. Well, yeah. So we're already in the end of our great special session. Wow, I learned a lot. Sir Gore, I hope to see you, man. If the Lord would grant that opportunity. What are your closing remarks, Mr. Gore?
Well, it's just been a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the invitation, and I wish you and your listeners and your ministry the very best, and anticipate God will continue to use you in a powerful way. So thank you for letting me be a small part of your ministry. Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you very much, Mr. Gore, for this wonderful opportunity. Wow, it's for you viewers who's watching us, we hope that you learned something. This not only to me interesting and thought-provoking, but at the same time it's educational for all of us. And we hope that you would share this to your loved ones, to your friends, especially those who are skeptics and skeptical about, and until now still having doubts about the future, about history, and all that, especially with the credibility and reliability of Christianity and the scriptures itself. Please, we highly encourage you guys to, there's still hope, it's not the end of the world. Build more curiosity, build more motivation to reach out to more people and to investigate more of the scriptures and of the facts. As what Mr. Gore said, right? Facts are important. Yeah, it's more. It should be more of a spotlight in history than our beliefs. So, facts has to be there, right? So thank you very much for watching once again. Please please like this Facebook page, the Fellowship League, Facts, Cross, and Discourse. Oh, we have a YouTube channel also. Please subscribe to it and click the bell button. And be updated with more of our new contents here. These are valuable information, and this is for free. So just for you guys to know, I want to be transparent. This is not monetized. Okay, so this is all for free for the glory of God and for the person of Christ. So thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you again next time. God bless you.
Thank you very much.